Hey guys, this is Eckhartsladder. Hello and welcome to another EcksToo video. So we've got something a little bit different today. We'll be taking a bit of a break from our Star Wars Squadrons coverage to talk about something really related, and that is the phenomenal TIE Fighter short film by Paul Johnson, also known as OdaKing77077 on YouTube. Before I begin, let me just say, Paul is a phenomenally nice guy. I've gotten the chance to talk to him a few times. He's one of the people that I support on Patreon, and whenever I stop in on one of his streams, he always makes sure to say hi. We have talks sometimes afterwards. So if you're a fan of Paul's work, consider supporting him somehow. If you pledge on Patreon, he does these really cool monthly works of art, which he actually sends you, and there's just a lot of really cool stuff you can see on his page. Anyway, Paul created this phenomenal short film based around a battle between a rebel and Imperial fleet. Many of you guys have probably already seen it, but what you might not realize is that it is very heavily inspired by the classic X-Wing and TIE Fighter series, and specifically the second game, which is TIE Fighter. Star Wars Squadrons is essentially a spiritual successor to TIE Fighter, so I thought it was a great time to look back at the phenomenal animation and just talk about it with you guys. And down in the comments, make sure that you let me know what you thought was the best part about this animation, if there's any insight that I missed, or just any thoughts that you might have. So the TIE Fighter short film is made in a 2D 80s anime style, and the incredible thing about this is that Paul illustrates every single scene. Paul describes it as a sort of compromise between 80s style hand animation and modern CGI. If you watch the film or watch some of his other videos, and there's one specifically called How to Animate an 80s Anime Ship, you can see that there are a lot of details applied scene by hand, and that's a lot of what gives the film so much detail and really so much heart. When you're doing something like this by hand, there's so many details that you can add, and the imperfections almost add like a personality. The animation, of course, is paired with a sort of glam metal soundtrack, which I really like. When I was younger, I definitely preferred Star Wars music alongside this, but as I've gotten older, I've really appreciated the sort of feel that the 80s style glam metal gives this. Anyway, whenever you're watching this animation, I just encourage you to stop and pause. Look at all the really little details, whether it's in the cockpit or starfighter battles going on in the background, because there's so much work put into this that it's really worth enjoying. And one thing I really love about this, besides for the detail, is how you can tell just how much of a Star Wars and TIE Fighter fan OdaKing is, and how much he thought out the nuances of how the battle would work, because we do see a lot of detail. I don't want to use the word realism because Star Wars space combat is not realistic, but everything works really logically from an in-universe perspective. Almost brutally so, as we'll see later. Anyway, this film starts off with a rebel fleet, and a standard one. We've got a Nebulon B, we've got some CR-90s and GR-75s, and then we have the really cool scene of the probe droid helping to call the Imperial fleet in through hyperspace, and I just love the visual with that. The Imperial fleet, once it arrives, is incredibly menacing, and we definitely get a few overt TIE Fighter references here. We get the pilots getting into their craft. As I mentioned, lots of interior cockpit detail, which we'll come back to in a second. But then as the battle opens, we have the utility tug, which appeared in the X-Wing series, and the briefing stage before the battle is completely reminiscent of TIE Fighter. Paul actually details this in project materials, which you can find online for free. He says that care has been taken to accurately match the locations and mechanics of the 1994 TIE Fighter game, merging it with the visual style of the original trilogy. And you can find more about not only basic production details, but complete biographies for all of the main Imperial characters in a file linked in the description of his video. From what I remember, more detail about the interior of the cockpits and some little Easter egg and just some minutia, which is really impressive, can also be found on Paul's Patreon, which I don't want to give away for free, so consider checking that out. But moving forward, when we look at the inside of the cockpit, it should be very familiar to Star Wars Squadrons fans, because both squadrons and the cockpits here are based off of the interiors for the X-Wing series. We see the target, in this case an Imperial Star Destroyer, and we see the power system, which can shift energy between the engine, weapon, and shields. with, in this case, full power to weapons, which is cool. The HUD targeting in the next scene is very similar, and when we get to the actual space battle, there's just so much detail, and how everything is done to perfection. One thing that I really like that we don't even actually see in the original trilogy really is that different starfighters handle very differently. The TIE Bomber is essentially a boat compared to the much more nimble Interceptor. It can get decent speed, and we do see it pull off some maneuvers, but the TIE Interceptor can brake and cut just at incredible speeds. We see that the X-Wing appears to have put full power towards its rear shield, but despite having more features and being a little more versatile, can still be gunned down by an Imperial pilot. The Y-Wings aren't nearly as fast, but we do see that they can lay down an absolutely devastating barrage, and can move on to attack capital ships as they do in one of my favorite scenes of the short film, as a small contingent of Rebel fighters move off to attack the Interdictor. Besides for Star Wars Rebels, Interdictors didn't really get a whole lot of attention outside of Star Wars books and comics, despite them being one of the most important tools in the Empire's arsenal. Well, of course, besides for some classic games like TIE Fighter. So it's really cool that breaking the interdiction screen is one of the main plot points of this battle, and just the shot of the Y-Wings being escorted by the X-Wings is really, really cool. The missile dispersion of the Interdictor is also really creative, and then we see the interceptors flying over the Star Destroyer into battle. It's all a really great, very punchy, action-packed scene. The fixed camera featured in some shots, which follows ships, also works really well to give off that sort of video game feeling. The run on the CR-90 and later Nebulon B reminded me a lot of Star Wars Squadrons, although that game is first person, because it helps put the fighters into scale, I think, and really helps position them as almost like flies attacking this giant capital ship. This ship, which is just infinitely more powerful and can destroy them with a single laser volley if they happen to slow down long enough to get caught. We do see some of that too in this battle. It's very brutal. Both the Empire and Rebels lose ships to just stray turbo laser shots, or a gunner who gets in the right position for just half a second. The most ridiculous, and I mean this in a good way, moment has to be when the TIE Bomber obliterates an entire flight of X-Wings using its cluster missiles. And this is actually exactly how cluster missiles work in Star Wars Squadrons. You can target as many starfighters, at least up to a certain limit, as you can within your field of view, and then the missile is just fired and splits off between its targets. I like this because the TIE Bomber is almost always treated as just a duck of a starfighter. It's not very fast. Unlike the Y-Wing, it has no shields, but the thing also has an incredible amount of firepower and can certainly be deadly in the right situations. The climax of the animation is something we almost never see in Star Wars, maybe only briefly in Rogue One, and that is the full potential of an Imperial Star Destroyer. The captain dramatically points the guns forward, and those huge octuple barbettes and the other turbo lasers and ion cannons fire upon the enemy fleet, just devastating it. There's so much background detail, little fights going on even during this scene that, again, take a second to stop and appreciate just the amount of work and art that went into this film. The scene of the beams crushing through the ships is very anime-esque and incredibly brutal. The death of the CR-90 with its engine splitting apart is also very satisfying. All in all, this wasn't a Rebel fleet with plot armor. This wasn't what would happen in the movies. This was a very well-armed Imperial battle group jumping on a Rebel convoy and taking care of business. All in all, Oda King is incredibly talented. He does amazing, phenomenal work, and if you enjoyed this, make sure to check out his YouTube channel, because there's lots of awesome sci-fi and fantasy art that he has prepared for you that you can see him work on during his live streams, and he's a hell of a nice guy. Anyway guys, that's all for me today. I hope you enjoyed my breakdown of this phenomenal piece of art on YouTube that we're lucky enough to view for free. I hope this got you in the mood for some Star Wars Squadrons content, and it certainly got me in the mood for a playthrough of one of the X-Wing games, so keep an eye open for that before Squadrons drops. Until next time guys, this has been Eckhartsladder. Be safe, and may the Force be with you.